This is perhaps the saddest story of the 20th century. Every time I've heard of this story, or I've listened to this story, or I've read this story, it always leaves me feeling very sad, and feeling sad for the characters involved, and in particular the main characters. And in this case, it's a woman who went by the name Alexandra Feodorovna, who often is referred to as Alexei. Now, Alexei was the wife of the last Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas. Now, Tsar Nicholas comes from a family of the Romanovs, and the Romanovs ruled Russia for close to 300 years, was for a while. And the Romanovs were removed from power in 1919 or 1917, 1918 during the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, Alexei came from a royal family, of course. She was a daughter of a German royal family, and her coming from Germany plays a major role in the story that is told about her and how she's portrayed in a very negative way, not only in Russia, but in the rest of the world after she faces a very brutal death, where she loses her life and the entire of her family. But the story is told in such a way that she still looks bad, but when you have some basic understanding of what was going on, then you might have a different view of who she was and whether indeed she was this person that is portrayed in most of these stories. Now, Alexei, as I've said, came from a German royal family, but the family was very closely related to the British monarchy. In fact, Alexei was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Yes, the one Queen Victoria who ruled Britain or the United Kingdom for a very long time. And at some point, in fact, she was to be married to King George, the son of Queen Victoria, and she would have become basically a British queen, if we might say so, not like a ruling monarch, but she would have belonged into that family. And King George is the father of Queen Elizabeth, who died very recently. And but Alexei didn't like King George. The family tried to link her, to match her to him, but she didn't like him. And then she went to Russia to visit her sister, who was married to some Russian royal member of the royal family in Russia. And she meets Tsar Nicholas, who was a young man by then, about 16 years, and he was the one to take over after his father passes on. And she ends up liking Tsar Nicholas, or she ended up liking Nicholas. He was not yet Tsar by then. And Nicholas comes to Britain, where Alexei used to stay most of the time. After the death of her mother, she was very close to Queen Victoria. And in fact, Queen Victoria took up the role of being like a mother to her, because her mother died while she was very young. And it is said that when Queen Victoria died, is the first time that most Russians saw her cry. That's how close she was to Queen Victoria. Now, I've gone ahead with that. Now, things move along, but before she gets married to Nicholas, both sides of the family, or both sides of the families, did not really want them to get married. Queen Victoria didn't like Russians. She had no problem with Nicholas, but she didn't like Russians, and she tried to encourage Alexei not to get married to Nicholas, simply because she didn't like Russians. Meanwhile, in Russia, the Russians, starting with the father of Nicholas and his mother, they didn't like the idea of him marrying a woman who came from Germany. The Russians at this point saw Germans as their greatest enemies. So they didn't like the idea that their son was going to marry a German woman who would likely end up being a queen. So there was that opposition to them getting married. But anyways, because both were very persistent that they wanted to get married, both sides of the families basically gave up and let them get married. But now this lays the foundation of the stories that are told about Alexei. And if you get to understand this background, then you might see her in a different light from what is told of her in movies and songs and things like that. When she goes to Russia and she gets married, she's getting married into a family that almost the entire family doesn't like her. And she's getting married into a nation that didn't like her simply because she was German. Now, in fact, it's said that when she got married, the day of her wedding, most Russians saw it as a bad omen because the wedding happened almost immediately after the burial of the previous king, the father of Nicholas. And most Russians were like, this is not a good sign. And then on the day of their coronation, thousands of people died in a stampede that happened because people were fighting over food, basically, and very many people died. And Russians were like, "This is another sign that this marriage is not a good thing. It shouldn't have happened." And then things became went from bad to worse from that point on. In Russia, it was only sons who would become king. The daughters would not become queen, like it is the case in Britain or the United Kingdom. So it was expected that, or once they got married, they were expected to have a son very fast so that they can assure the nation that there was somebody who will take over in case something happened to Nicholas. Now, the first child comes, it's a daughter, and everybody's like, oh, okay. The second child comes, it's a daughter. Now, the first daughter is Olga, and these names are very popular in pop culture, like they are mentioned a lot. Even cartoons are made about these girls, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Now, Olga is the first child born. The second child comes is a daughter. The third child comes is a daughter. Now, the nation is getting worried. Son Nicholas himself and the entire family are getting worried. What's going on? In fact, at the highest level of power, people started now treating the brother of Nicholas, the younger brother who went by the name Michael, as the next king. Basically was the king, the heir apparent, because now they were like, Alexei seems like he's not going to give Nicholas a son. Now we just start focusing on his younger brother as a person who is likely to take over when Nicholas is no longer able, or something, if something happens to him. Then the fourth child comes, is another girl, Anastasia. And at this point, Nicholas is so worried that he goes and he starts talking to people. He finds this doctor who promises him that he could do something so that the next child is a boy, and his name was Philippe Nazier Fachot. Now, this guy promises Alexei and the husband Nicholas that he could do something to make sure that the next child becomes is a boy. That there's a way he could change the gender of the child, and the child will become a boy if it's a girl, even when the child is already conceived. And he had them involve some mystics, and some prayers were done and things like that, and some rituals. And yes, the fifth child is born, and it's a boy. And of course, everybody is relieved that, okay, now we have somebody will take over in case something happens to Nicholas. Now, the son is named Alexei. Now, it turned out that Alexei came from a family that carried hemophilic genes. Hemophilia is this condition that is transferred from parent to child. It's inherited, and it's a condition that when you have it, you bleed a lot, and you can bleed to death even from very minor injuries. Now, when the son is born, Alexei, it turns out he comes out with this condition. This condition is said that it is the royal family of the UK that basically became the source of this disease to the royal families in Europe. Remember, in Europe, the royal families used to marry from one another. So when this problem emerged from UK, it spread to all the other royal families in Europe, and so happened that the Russian royal family became a victim of it. So the son is born and he has this problem, and quickly the doctors figure out that this boy has hemophilia, and of course they tell the parents about it. And of course, now this is another problem. Now they were celebrating that they have a son, but now the son is sick, and he is sick of a condition that cannot be cured. And now this sickness becomes the source of the downfall of the Romanov family from the Russian power. Alexei becomes so desperate that she wants to get a cure for the son, and she tried so many things, and at some point it was suggested to her that there was this guy who came from Siberia, the eastern part of Russia, who had this mystical power, and he could heal. He was a kind of like a priest or a pastor or somebody of that kind, and he preached and he prayed for people. And this person is recommended, and his name was Rasputin. Now, Gregory Rasputin. Now, Gregory Rasputin, his name is also a big name now. There's a song that is sung by Bonnie M by the name Rasputin, and it talks about Rasputin being this man who preached, and the women wanted to be with him, which is basically the story that is told about Alexei. Because Alexei got attracted to this guy because he was told, remember, Alexei is so desperate, he wants his son to get healed. And there's this man who prays for people and people get healed. And he's told that this man is going to pray for the son and the son would get healed. So Rasputin is invited into the palace and he starts praying for this boy. And something used to happen. This boy would become very sick. And when Rasputin prays for the boy, kind of like get healed. We would never know what was going on there. And then there was this one time when now Rasputin got to have a huge control over the royal family. There was one time when this boy became very sick, and in fact everybody thought that the boy was going to die. And then Alexei sends a telegram to Rasputin telling him that the boy is very sick, and Rasputin sends a message back telling her, don't worry, the boy is not going to die, the boy is going to be well. And indeed the boy recovered, and that kind of like became a sign to Alexei and her family that this was indeed a man of God. And up to the end, when she was killed, she believed that Rasputin was a man of God. Now Rasputin was a guy of very weird character. He was a con man. Let's start from there. Now it's very clear that he was a con man. Whatever was happening with him telling her the boy will be okay, it could have been just a coincidence that the boy became well. But because of that, he got a lot of power over Alexei and even her husband, Nicholas. Now, Rasputin basically started living in the palace, and everything he said would go. In fact, he started influencing the appointment of government officials, including ministers. If he had a problem with you, you will be sacked, and that's how powerful he became. And some people started becoming, of course, very uncomfortable with this stranger in the palace who was having a lot of say on how government was running. Now, Rasputin started spreading rumors, and now this is where this is where the personality of Alexei starts becoming tainted. Rasputin said that there is one time he was in a restaurant and he used to drink a lot. And he was drunk and he started bragging that he controls the monarchy. He's the one who decides who becomes what in the palace and in the nation. And this one time he took off his clothes and pointed to his genitals, and he's telling people on the street that this one rules Russia. Now that became the source of the biggest scandal in Russia and now in history, because now everybody started saying that Alexei was sleeping with Rasputin, and Rasputin was having a lot of power over her because of that. But when you look at it carefully, maybe that did happen, but there is no evidence of it ever happening. And a drunk con man can say anything, especially when they want to be seen as having a lot of influence so that they can con more people. So it's likely Rasputin was just creating stories so that he can be seen to be this powerful man in Russia. But that story stuck, and people started saying that Alexei was having an affair with Rasputin. And now, remember, Alexei was never liked in Russia because he was German. And at this time, when Rasputin is having a lot of influence in the palace, Russia is now fighting in the First World War with Germany. Now, Germany is indeed an enemy at this point. Now, the stories that are being spread about Alexei had a lot to do with the fact that the Russians saw her as a German mole, in fact. And in fact, they used to say that she was basically doing things in the palace to make sure that Germany wins over Russia. So these stories are told. And then Rasputin does these things that he does. Now, people are so angry with Alexei because of those. So these negative stories are told. So you have to bear in mind that these negative stories are told of Alexei majorly because she's German, not because she did anything. When you read more about her, in fact, you realize that she was this modest woman who didn't entertain immorality. uh, we will never know at a very personal level, but how she lived, it showed that she never entertained. In fact, we are told that she never invited anyone who had anything being said about them, or them being immoral or being adulterous, to the parties she held. She would not invite you. If there were stories told about you of not being faithful to your wife or to your husband, you are not going to be invited by Alexi to her parties. And they also told that if when women came to her parties, if they did not dress modestly, then she would turn them away. She didn't like seeing women who kind of like did not dress, cover themselves properly. So that's who she was. But that part of her is completely erased when it's talked about her having some affair with Rasputin, which there is no evidence really besides Rasputin bragging somewhere that this rules Russia. Around 1918, the Bolsheviks are coming. There's a revolution happening. And there was so much instability in the nation that a caretaker government was formed. Now, this caretaker government was supposed to be there in place and then to decide what Russia became after that. Was it going to be a republic? Was the monarchy going to be restored in some form? So there were those conversations going on. But Lenin and his people came and took advantage of the instability that was in the nation, and they basically toppled the caretaker government, and the people in the caretaker government basically ran away. Now, before the caretaker government fell, it made plans that the royal family had to be moved out of St. Petersburg to protect them. And in fact, they were having negotiations with Great Britain and Germany and these other nations to basically take the royal family. And in fact, they were begging Britain in particular to take Alexei and her family and Sir Nicholas. But Britain, by then it was King George who was ruling. He wasn't comfortable having them come to Britain because he wasn't so sure himself about how the British saw the royal family, and he maybe feared that the revolution will also come to Britain. So he said no. The Germans said no. The French said no. Everybody said no. So when the caretaker government, before it fell, it transferred the royal family to the eastern part of Russia, just to put them away from where they could be reached by the Bolsheviks. But now in the far east, they were not safe because soon the Bolsheviks took over. They took over everything. They took over the country. Now, but they were not yet in full control. There were these Russians who were called the Whites, and these are Russians who still believed in the tradition, and they still wanted to restore Russia into some sort of maybe a republic, or some have the monarchy maybe watered down but still around. And the Whites were fighting the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks don't have full control of the nation. Now the Bolsheviks, but they have the control of the royal family. That's Sir Nicholas, his wife Alexei, and their 4 daughters and their son, and they were holding them in some house in eastern Russia. But then Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, decides that the Whites were going to use Sir Nicholas as a symbol to galvanize support and maybe go fight the Bolsheviks, and he decides they have to die. So on the 16th of July 1918, we are told that Sir Nicholas and his kids were brought into a room where they were held and put there, and then they were all shot and they died there. Alexei was praying as she was being shot. She was very religious, very religious. That's one thing you get to know. When you interrogate more, you get to find that she was very religious, and maybe that's how Rasputin took advantage of her. So they are killed, and their bodies are taken and thrown into a mine shaft. And the bodies later on are removed from there, and then they are burned and destroyed and then they are hidden in some forest in eastern Russia. And those bodies remained there for 80 years until 1998, a few years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And that's when, during the reign of Boris Yeltsin as the president of Russia, that's when now the government of Boris Yeltsin decided that it wasn't good. What happened to the Romanov family wasn't good, and they set up a body that went and found these remains. These remains were taken, they were tested, they were confirmed to belong to the Romanov family, and then they were given now a decent burial. That was in 1990, and some of them were found later and were buried maybe I think 2008. So that is a very sad story when you hear what happened, especially Sir Nicholas. He was this monarch, and then he was told there's this point where, and these are from notes that were written by the people, the guards who were guarding them, And Sir Nicholas was trying to protect his family, and he basically was told there is nothing you can do, and he was just pushed aside. And this is a person who was very powerful in Russia, but he could not protect his family, and he just saw the entire family destroyed before his eyes. And so the story of Alexei being the cause of it, could be she was the cause of it, but maybe Lenin were already set in motion even before Rasputin came into the picture. So maybe she contributed, she hastened the process that led into the revolution, but trying to say that she's solely responsible for the revolution, I think, is stretching it too far. And the stories of her being having some affair going on with Rasputin, there is no evidence of that. Alexei had her own issues, though. We are told that she was so aloof from the people. She didn't see the need to try to appease the public. And in fact, we are told even Queen Victoria did talk to her about it, telling her, be careful. Even me as the Queen of England, I do my best try to have the people on my side. So don't be that aloof. And it is said that she told Queen Victoria, Russia is not UK. In Russia, the Russians worship their monarch. But then she was wrong on that.